Part 1 covered the concept and design of the shelf and building the leg forms. Now it is time to cast concrete for the legs. And now I'm ready to cast the first bracket. Down on the lower left I have an exhaust fan to blow out any of the fine particles of perlite and any cement dust. Over here the form is ready to go, and here are my components. Water, air entrainment admix, equal parts of cement and sand, fiberglass clippings to resist cracking, and of course, the perlite. I calculated 158 cubic inches of volume, and using 6 cups each of cement and sand, 1 tablespoon air entrainment, about 1/10 ounce fiberglass, and 1/2 gallon of water. I found mixing with perlite requires more water than normal concrete, and I think that's because perlite sucks up some of the water. I have a spreadsheet that does the calculations for me. First in the bucket goes the sand, cement, and fiberglass, and I twirl it around until it is about the same gray tone. Over on my workbench is an experiment of trying to make a cement mixer of a 5-gallon bucket, and that project keeps getting delayed. Now I add the air entrainment into the water and then pour about half that into the bucket. I'm making sure there are no clumps in the mix. And now it is time to start adding the perlite. Overmixing with the perlite damages the perlite and increases the density of the mix. I think I need to experiment by pre-soaking the perlite and see if I get a better, easier mix. We'll save that thought for another day. And this is my vibrator hack I made from my oscillating tool. The mix is still just a little dry, but you can see how vibration causes it to flow. Things that act like this are called non-Newtonian fluids. It needs to be mixed until it is all a uniform shade of dark gray to ensure the perlite is fully incorporated into the mix. After dropping in the rest of the perlite, I had a big cloud come out of the bucket and had to turn the fan on high. I have noticed the water is getting close to the right amount when nuggets start to form, and for this mix it looks like we'll need to add a bit more water. When close to the right water ratio, very little water makes a big difference, so in goes 1/2 cup. I decided to drop in another 1/3 cup of water, and I think it's ready, although it appears a bit stiff. Look at that. That will never flow, but look what a little vibration does to it. Before we go any further, Then I discovered I needed to shim up the form to make the top level so the mix does not flow off when vibrating. That board was a bit too thick and I had to find one a little bit thinner. This process is called screeding, which is to remove the mix above the form, and doing this pushed off one of the coves and I had to push it back in place. Now to move this one to the back of my bench and get started with bracket number 2. Everything's ready to go. I added a spacer to the bottom of this form and you can see by the bubble it is very close to level. I subtracted 1 cup each cement and sand for the next mix because I had so much extra and just mixed everything on top of the leftovers. I again turned the fan on high as you can see the cement and perlite dust in the air. The few times I've mixed this up, I've been getting the impression that the consistency gets better if I let it sit for a while, so once I get it all mixed up, I will try letting it set and ferment for about 15 minutes. Now I cap it off and wait. Almost 15 minutes later and I come back and take a look. Nothing noticeable, but it did start to get darker as I rotated the bucket, so I decided to go for another 15 minutes. Another 15 minutes later, and it looks pretty good. And now let's check it out with the vibrator. Make sure we're in the camera. You see what it does. You can see it in there with the rest of it. Touch of water. Add an ounce or two of water and now we're ready to go. Mixing low volumes like this, a little bit of water goes a long ways. Now we're ready. I discovered the oscillating tool trick while pouring a curb. One of the stakes was too long and I had to cut it off to be able to screed over it. That was a holy shit moment. Screeding over bracket number 2, and now you understand why that center plug had to be tapered. Bracket number 2 is now completed. Now, what to do with the leftovers? I can just throw it out, or what I've done in the past is fill up the bottom of a bucket and make a stepping stone. Now watch all of the clumps in the bottom of the bucket level out when I apply the vibrator. Now I'll wait 1 week before breaking them out of the forms. In the meantime, I can work on the form for the shelf as well as my shredder project. Let me get it done the rest of the way. I need to get good grip. I have a long board on the bench and need to cross-cut it to size, but it does not fit on the table saw. Also on the bench is my 48-inch cross-cut guide and a small circular saw that it was made for. I have the board spaced up off the bench with 2x4 cutoffs, 2 on the far end, 4 across both sides of the kerf, and 2 on the near end. Here is a look at my cut sheet for the entire form where it shows the base should be 39 1/2 long by 22 inches wide. Marking the board using a straight edge along with the square, and then position the cross-cut guide and line it up with the mark. I raise the blade on the saw so that it is just above the board and put it on the guides, then align the blade with the cut line. Now I set the blade height for the cut and run the saw down the guide. It took me 15 minutes to prepare this board for the cut. That only took a few seconds, and now I have to clean it all up. What I didn't mention before is that the board I had was not wide enough. I needed a 22-inch board, but this one is only 21 3/8. I'm going to add an extension to the board and then rip it back down to the proper size. Here's a piece of pine that is about the right size, but first I'm going to trim it down a little closer on the bandsaw. Back down on the bench, I'm getting prepared to cut biscuit slots to join the two boards. The location I put the biscuits is not critical, but they do have to match both boards, so using a square, I just draw a line across the boards. I will put one about 2 inches from each end, one in the middle, and 2 in between the others. I check that the biscuit cutter is set up properly before plugging it in. I marked one side of the large board and small boards to make sure it does not get flipped around before cutting or assembly, which could cause the biscuit slots to be misaligned. Cut the 5 slots on the base, then clamp down the smaller board and cut matching slots. Now I need to properly prep the joint. This is my 90-degree sanding block that must be at least 15 years old. On the face, there's an undercut that allows the sandpaper to slide in, providing a full sanding surface on the other face. On the ends, I have threaded steel inserts that hold the paper. Although this is an old strip, to install a new one, I would just fold the paper over and poke a hole in it for the screws. It uses 1032 truss head screws to hold the paper. And now to smooth out the glue joint. To ensure I've got a 90-degree edge, just make some light pencil marks across the edge, and when sanding over it should take off all the mark. Now back to the bench again to get them glued together. Temporarily insert the biscuits and get a couple of bar clamps ready. Once the 2 end bar clamps are positioned, I grab some more clamps and then glue it all up. I have some custom spacers I printed to elevate the board up off the bar clamps and also provide space for the glue line and any squeeze out. I'm using polyurethane glue for this one because it's going to need to be fully waterproof. Next step will be sanding that extra board down to the proper thickness and ripping to size. The glue is set up and now we're ready to finish cutting the base to the correct size. But first, we have to get rid of all these clamps. A close-up of the glue line shows how the polyurethane glue has expanded out of the joint. Those that do not like this type of glue is typically because they use too much and it makes a huge mess when it expands out the glue joint. What you see here is about what you should expect when the proper amount of glue is applied. Now it is time to sand down that joint, but first I need to wipe down the bench. This is 18mm plywood and I used 3/4 pine so that the edge overlapped both sides, and when sanded everything will be flush. I periodically run my finger down the glue joint and it is ready when I can no longer feel the edge. The finished board needs to be 22 inches across, so now it's off to the table saw that is already set up for the cut. And I've got just... Here I've got the form for the shelf almost ready to go. The 4 locating pin sockets sitting in the middle, the coves for the radius corners to the right, and 3 pieces of rebar. Now over there at the end of the bench are the 2 leg brackets that have been aging for 1 week, waiting for the concrete to cure, and today we're going to break them out. Of course, the first thing I have to do is get the shelf form out of the way. The legs are wrapped up in plastic trash bag to ensure they didn't dry out. The only thing I was really worried about was getting the pins out of the mold. I decided to cut off the pin guides and then see if I can just pull the pins out. Fingers crossed. Switching the concrete vibrator back to an oscillating tool as it was designed. A cut along the glue line and broke it off. I was unable to twist the pin, so thinking it's going to need a little more cutting. Now pulling all the screws to open up the form. A couple of light taps on the rear wall and it's moving right out. That's okay. Now trying to separate it from the base, and here is where I ran into trouble. Trying to be careful because it is not yet fully cured. I'm thinking that because I did not seal the plug, it has expanded due to the moisture and locked itself in place. I put a 2-degree draft on the plug, but apparently that was not enough because it cracked. I'm going to attempt to glue it back together using the polyurethane adhesive. If this does not work, I will have to make 2 more legs without the center cut out. I had the exact same results on the second leg. We're going to let this finish curing. It's not hard enough yet. This is the end of part 2. Part 3 will be experimenting with different mixing methods for the perlite concrete, looking for a faster, easier, more consistent mixing method. And part 3 will be the conclusion, building the form for the shelf and placing the concrete, then installing it in the potting bench. Be sure to subscribe to be notified when new content is uploaded.